Thanks for tuning in to The Leadership Beat, a Bates Communications original podcast series exploring leadership trends and inspiring leaders to innovate and think differently.
Well, welcome everyone to the Leadership Beat. I'm Suzanne Bates, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Rosabeth Moss Kanter, who is the Ernest L. Arbuckle Professorship at Harvard Business School, specializing in strategy, innovation, and leadership for change. And of course, on this show, we interview thought leaders who are promoting breakthrough, innovative ideas. And Rosabeth is certainly one of those people. She teaches, she writes, she consults to global leaders, and she is the author or co-author of 20 books, including her very latest, which is Think Outside the Building, How Advanced Leaders Can Change the World One Smart Innovation at a Time. Rosabeth, welcome.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. A terrible time, but great to be with you, Suzanne.
Yes, it is. And we're speaking on April 7th, and we are just before what is predicted to be the crest of the pandemic here in the U.S. And of course, it's a very uncertain time, a time when people are predicting transformation, not only now, but post-pandemic. And I'm really interested in getting your views on that. And I thought first we could talk a little bit about the business world, about leadership, how leaders are meeting the challenge. We've seen so many businesses rise to the challenge and switch over to making things that are going to help us get through the crisis. But how do you think generally business leaders are doing right now?
Well, big companies have many more options in terms of the flexibility to change over production, to deploy certain senior executives to work on initiatives with other companies. I think small and mid-sized are hurt the most, although I know of some mid-sized companies where leaders are rising to the challenge, trying to keep their people working remotely, trying to reach out to the community. I think this is a time when leaders are who they are. That is, if they have not been particularly sensitive, humane, people-centered, community-oriented in the past, it's hard to rush to do that now. And there are some leaders in past crises who have responded very badly. And I won't talk about any particular national leaders in the US right now, but there have been leaders who have thought it's all a plot against them. In the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a few years ago, the leader, the CEO of BP, was a whiner and complainer who said, "Why is this happening to me?" Well, it wasn't about him, it was a disaster. And so the best leaders understand it's not all about them, and they have to look inside themselves to their own sense of purpose. They have to think which stakeholders they're going to serve right now, because there will be no long-term shareholder value if they don't do the right thing during this crisis.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up leadership, because it is an important variable or factor, I think, in our recovery. And we're hearing so many different predictions about what's going to happen. And of course, who really knows? But there are some who are predicting a deep, long global recession, and others who are hoping for, or maybe even expecting, we'll have a faster, much faster recovery. What do you think is going to happen? And how much does that depend on the kind of leadership our companies have?
Well, I certainly hope for a faster recovery. I mean, we all do. I mean, nobody wants this to go on for a long time, but I'm afraid that it is going to be a long time. First of all, because the onset of the virus is happening at different rates in different places around the US and the world. There are many disruptions and dislocations that are going to be hard to simply put back in place. I think one reason many workers are being furloughed rather than completely let go is so that a company could grab them again. But who knows if those workers are going to want to do the same thing. Supply chains are disrupted, and things are not happening at exactly the same rate everywhere. As we saw in the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, global financial crisis, Great Recession, we saw that it took a while to recover, but some industries came back on, and it takes a lot of actions on the part of a lot of people. It's not just consumers going back to their local stores. It's whether manufacturers can manufacture, whether service workers feel safe going to work. So the safety factor is one thing that some companies are stepping up to and that labor unions are stepping up to. I think we might see a resurgence of worker protests and of union activism. So many things are going to be different. And companies are realizing how much they depend on other institutions around them. The schools that educate their children and their employees' children, the hospitals and health systems that take care of them and their employees. And those dependencies are going to need to be enhanced. That is, companies have to make sure that those other institutions are up and running and can serve also.
Now, there's so much work that will need to be done, as you've so aptly pointed out there, and certainly a lot of questions, I think, about how we will go back to work and how we will feel when we go back to work. I think a lot of companies now are beginning to think about what will change in terms of how they pivot, the products, the services, how they go to market, how they do supply chain. And I know in Think Outside the Building, you talked a lot about castles, about fortresses, you know, how hard it is to knock those down. And I would imagine that this pandemic is one of those completely unexpected events that will shake a lot of castles.
Definitely, and also will provide lots of innovation, which is also my point in Think Outside the Building. If you're stuck in your own silo, in your own industry, in your own department, in your own office, in your own industry, you often don't see enough about how you can contribute to not only innovation for yourself, but also to change in the world around you. And it's heartening to see many innovations start, new partnerships start. GE Aviation partnering with General Motors for certain manufacturing. GE Health Systems, maybe it's partnering with General Motors. GE Aviation is doing some other things. I think that what might be different in businesses is a little more sobering reality that you can't just squeeze everything from a workforce. You have to care for their welfare and well-being also. Secondly, relaxing certain rules that have made it harder to do flexible work, not just remote work. People don't want to work remotely all the time. I mean, I am now, you are now, but I think flexible work, when people can help set their own schedules, take care of their families, and not be as rigidly defined as they had been in the past. I think this will accelerate the use of technology, but it will also point to the digital divide, that not everybody has access to technology, and therefore, if we're more dependent on online meetings and conversations, then certain people will be left out even more. And I can't predict, but the best way to predict the future, it said, is to create it. And I think there are many leaders at many levels, grassroots, state levels, governors, mayors, CEOs, mid-sized companies that are stepping up to the challenge, and they will create innovations that can last.
Let's talk about something that's also likely to change, which is our relationship, especially between the US and China, or China and the world. We know there's going to be pressure on life sciences to source differently, to maybe bring manufacturing back to the US because of safety issues. And then there are many, many companies that are doing a huge percentage of their business in China, from Nike to Starbucks to, I mean, you name it. So what do you think is going to happen there? How is the US going to view China, and how are business leaders going to respond to the social pressure?
So one thing business leaders have to recognize, and again, I think there are many great savvy business leaders who recognize this, is that they can't deal with a country like China on their own. We can't count just on private diplomacy. We need government diplomacy to level the playing field and make it possible for US businesses to import, export, and so forth. I think China, of course, is the giant that we've been talking about, but I think we also have to worry about Japan, which has supplied the United States and is a big economy. South Korea. South Korea has conducted itself very well in the pandemic. They have some problems to solve. They have some great companies. They also have some corruption in some big companies. And then how companies globalize. I mean, it's true that there will be a search for local suppliers, but I think companies have to be more proactive, especially big ones. In the global financial crisis, in the recovery, we saw that small businesses weren't recovering as much, and I worked with IBM on creating a program called Supplier Connection, in which a number of big companies banded together and did an online, easy way for small businesses to bid on their contracts. And the Small Business Administration recognized that there are many imaginative ways that companies can find the suppliers who are already in their midst or who could easily pivot to serve them. And I think that in the future, a combination of local and global, I think that the China and the manufacturing in low-wage countries had been driven by just that, low wages, and whether there will be a rethinking of how much we want to squeeze out costs as opposed to produce quality and keep people safe. But I think we still will have a globalized world with global trade. But how we come out of it depends on how much we care about other places. I think it's totally wonderful that the New England Patriots sent their plane to China, and China provided so much personal protective gear. Maybe it was ventilators in that plane also, to come back to Massachusetts, my home state. I mean, isn't that wonderful? I mean, the generosity that's being shown all over the world says that we are all in it together.
Mm. You know, it strikes me though, and people have different views of China, certainly, but in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, you and I were both working with global leaders then as well, the breach of trust really was with the financial community, right? Now we have a breach of trust that's primarily with China because they were not transparent in the beginning. And so what's going to happen? Because now we have mistrust on a global geopolitical scale.
Yeah. I don't want to demonize China in this. I think it's a breach of trust in government leaders. I think that word was coming from China in early January. I know many Harvard scientists understood what was going on. There were many warnings. I think that the breach of trust is with government leaders who didn't act fast enough. And while I feel incredibly sorry that UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is ailing, is in critical condition in the hospital, but he was one of those who wanted to deny the whole thing because they wanted to put a good face on this. And so we haven't been listening to our experts and scientists. I think there's been a disregard for science and for facts in recent years. And if I don't really want to put the blame anywhere, but if I put the blame, it's there. And it's while I don't want to say that China acted totally honorably, but there is a tendency for political leaders to want to deny and minimize. And that's what happened in China. It's happened in the US. It's happened in other countries too. And so it is a failure of leadership. And that tends to happen in every crisis that takes a long time to abate.
We could talk about so many industries, but I'm curious because I know you have a great interest in the environment about what do you think is going to happen to attitudes, to views on the environment. For example, I would say minimalism was beginning to take hold, right? And people were beginning to question fast fashion and things like that. And I do wonder now, having been at home, people maybe feel they need less. There may be some other societal pressures that will accelerate movements like that and create innovation. But what do you think about that?
Well, I think that humans have a tendency when crises are over to revert to things that make them feel good. But if I were in industries that are dependent on having people discard what they use or getting food flown from all over the world when in fact there are sources in your region, I think there will be less of that. I think that trend towards slow food or local food will grow. I think the trend toward using things longer before discarding them. So many industries, including smartphones, are all dependent on upgrades to the next model. They may slow that down a little and think about other kinds of services. But I don't know how consumers will behave. I don't know whether this doing with less right now by sheltering at home is going to open a hunger for luxuries. I think chocolate should do very, very well.
There's, again, so many industries that we could touch on here. But I do wonder, just generally speaking, about, the political world as well. Now we have political leaders who have had to work together during a crisis. We see the president and Democratic governors and others working together, although it's not perfect by any means. We have such political divisions in this country, and without making a judgment about either party, I wonder what you think will happen when we all get back together again. Will we go back to the same divisions we've always had?
Well, if we don't make structural changes, and if we don't allow certain innovations to surface and take hold, then we won't improve our society. We'll be left with some of the same fissures we have now, which is why I write about thinking outside the building, thinking about the fact that there are poor people surrounding affluent neighborhoods, people who don't have access to health care, people who racially have been discriminated against. And those divides, that's one kind of divide that will continue unless there's action to do something about it. And in responses to this crisis, there are variations in how much leaders around the country, private sector and public sector, are taking into account how to try to remedy certain problems at the same time they're helping people through the crisis, because we now see how much we need what were called low-wage workers. What a fight there's been in the United States about $15 an hour minimum wage. And there are many companies that are now voluntarily providing a $15 an hour minimum wage for frontline service workers because they see how essential they are. And it's a wonderful gesture to help people through the crisis. So it might accelerate some good things that help us see that we have to weather this together. It's hard to say. I mean, right now we have to live in the here and now and deal with mitigation efforts. But I urge leaders, the ones that I talk to and the ones who are listening to this, I urge leaders to think beyond the crisis too, to think about what kind of a world they want to see when this is over. And do they want it to be just the way it was before? It probably won't be no matter what. But is this an opportunity to accelerate a sense of purpose and meaning, to make sure the company stands for something, that leaders in the company stand for something larger than themselves, are valued and honored, and feel that they're making a difference? Those are the companies that consumers are going to want to come back to, and the companies that employees are going to feel loyal to after it's all over.
Well said. So I'm curious about how your life has changed during this time. I know you're working virtually, as all of us are, from your virtual office and consulting and teaching and all, but maybe at a deeper level, what are you thinking about, and what do you think is going to endure for you?
I think this is a time of grief and mourning. I feel very deeply for the people who are suffering losses. I feel that I wish I personally could do more. So I follow the news, I hear about causes, I try to publicize them and people who are doing good things. But it's so easy for everybody to feel a little helpless. And part of the message of my book, Think Outside the Building, is that we have to take action. That passivity is very depressing. And I don't want to see a lot of depressed people emerge from this crisis, even if they've worked at home and they feel they're sort of productive. That where you get energy is from taking action. I call it the optimism of activism. And my whole book is a call to action that lets ourselves be the army of democracy who creates the innovations that make a difference, not just in our companies, but also in our communities. That's something that will make our families proud, will make us feel that we've made a difference. And I know that there are many leaders who are watching this or listening to this who themselves feel they've got so much to take care of, they have to worry about cash flow. Of course, there are many, many worries. But the other question is, what do you stand for? And what can be done now to make sure that we live up to our values?
Well said. Do you have any final words of wisdom for executives who are really just all struggling right now to lead through this unprecedented time?
So one of the things I often advise is ask people for help. The people who are still remaining in your companies, and even some of those you're in touch with who have been furloughed, they have ideas. Ask them. All wisdom, that's another point of Think Outside the Building, all wisdom does not have to come from the top. So outside the castle are lots of little villages that people have constructed to create new ways of doing things. Find out what your people are engaged in. Find out how you and the company might be helpful. This is a great time to hear employee and community members' voices.
Well, Rosabeth, that's a very heartening message, and we very much appreciate your time today. Congratulations on your latest book, Think Outside the Building, and thank you for joining us today.
Suzanne, it's an incredible pleasure, and thank you for the service that you're doing for the people who are listening to this.